Greetings in Christ, everybody, and welcome to Catholicism and Culture. I am Steve Greene, Director of Holy Family Institute of Catholic Faith and Life. And what I want to kind of walk around intellectually a little bit today is the question of what is the ultimate reality. Let me first explain what I mean by that term. So it could sometimes called ultimate reality, sometimes called fundamental reality. And in a sense, those two ways of expressing it sort of circle around and meet again at the far end of the circle. But the question of what is the ultimate or fundamental reality is the question of what is that reality which explains everything else. So if you press behind reality as we observe and experience it, what is the ultimate explanation for it? What undergirds everything that we observe and experience? Where does it ultimately come from? What is it ultimately made of? What ultimately explains it? So obviously, just thinking of the definition, it's probably fairly apparent that you could attack that question, what is the ultimate reality, from a number of different perspectives, even from a number of different disciplines. Some would claim that that's a question that science has to answer. That's a scientific question. What is the ultimate or foundational reality? This would be the approach of someone who would say something like the Higgs boson, I think, is the most elemental particle or subparticle that's been discovered or proven to exist by science. So, if something like the Higgs boson, which tellingly is often referred to as the God particle, that field of science which kind of pushes, I think it's, there's some overlap in discipline in the sciences, but the scientific quest for the so-called God particle is really the quest to find what is the smallest discrete particle or subparticle of matter from which all other matter and material objects, particles, elements, molecules, etc., atoms, subatomic particles are constructed. So it can be looked at as a scientific question. It can also, of course, be looked at as a philosophical question. And it can be looked at as a theological question. The point, and the reason that it's of interest to me, especially in terms of these Catholicism and culture videos, is that it should be obvious to anyone that no matter what your perspective on the question, what is the ultimate or fundamental reality, how you answer that is going to have profound implications for your worldview. It's going to have profound implications for your anthropology. It's going to have profound implications for your understanding of the moral universe, the natural law, etc. And so it's a question worth examining. I'm going to oversimplify my take on it, and I'm going to do that intentionally simply because I'm not launching a semester-long graduate course on the question, what is the ultimate reality? I'm just recording a short video that hopefully will be thought-provoking and maybe a good conversation starter or encourage people to do a little bit more digging and thinking on their own on this question. But I'm going to kind of broad stroke the question a bit and compare and contrast kind of our current cultural default answer to that question, what is the ultimate or fundamental reality, with the classical answer from both pagan antiquity, for instance, the great Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonists, up through the Middle Ages. So I'll just call it the classical worldview, and take that to mean, when I say the classical worldview, to basically mean sort of the Judeo-Christian or Greco-Christian intellectual tradition vis-a-vis this question, what is the ultimate or foundational reality? Now, although, and I'll start with the kind of the classical worldview and the classical take on this question. Although there would certainly be fairly profound theological differences between the Greeks, say, and the Jews, or between the Greeks and the early Christians, philosophically, they were actually in impressive harmony on the answer to this question, reasoning their way to the answer, what is the ultimate, to the question, what is the ultimate or fundamental reality? The Greeks, the Jews, the Christians, all came to essentially the same conclusion. There is an intelligence which has ordained and ordered if not, and certainly this is the case for the Jews and the Christians, created all the reality that we observe and experience. And so for the Greeks, for the Jews, for the Christians, all of those thinkers in antiquity, and in the Middle Ages, they would have simply said, listen, everything that we observe and experience in the universe is ultimately explained by an intellect and a will, a divine intellect and a will, although the Greeks would mean something different by divine than the Jews and the Christians did. Nonetheless, all of them concluded, not using theology, they disagreed on the theology, but philosophically, that there must be a divine intellect. Now, some of the reasons that they came to that conclusion, being brief about it, were they noticed that there were things observable in the universe and things we experience in the universe, like intellect, like will, like consciousness, like reason. And so for the Greek philosophers, for the Jewish philosophers, and especially for the Christian philosophers who followed on the Greeks and the Jews, who inherited an intellectual tradition and a philosophical tradition from both, they said, in order for there to be intelligence, consciousness, will, memory, mind, in order for there to be rational inquiry in the world, experiential and observed, there must be intelligence, mind, will behind the universe. You couldn't get intellect, you couldn't get will, you couldn't get reason, you couldn't get consciousness in the things that we experience and observe in the universe, beginning first, of course, with ourselves, in which we experience all of those capacities and powers, if the universe were merely material. Now, why would they say that? They would say that because matter cannot give what matter does not have. In other words, matter, which is not conscious, which is not free, does not possess will, the ability to choose and to act, matter, which has no intellect or rational intelligence, cannot impart on things made entirely of matter, consciousness, intellect, will, mind, memory, etc. All of those, and here's to borrow a Greek term that's used quite capably and frequently by the Christian philosophers as well, those are all metaphysical realities, meaning realities that we experience and observe in the things in the universe that are above or beyond, that's the Greek meta, above or beyond the physical, the material. So philosophically looking at the universe, what we experience and observe in it, especially when we experience and observe consciousness, intellect, and will, the Greeks, the Jews, the Christians concluded whatever it is that ultimately explains reality, that ultimately explains the universe, that ultimately explains what we experience and observe in the universe, must itself be conscious, be rational, and be free, have the ability to choose and to act. And all of them notice that the point where you come to that conclusion, you're describing a person, not necessarily a human person. This is where they would have all said divine person, that this being, this ultimate reality which explains everything else which exists, must be conscious, rational, and free. Therefore, it must be a person, because only persons are conscious, rational, and free. And so this divine person, which Plato called the divine craftsman, which Aristotle called the unmoved mover or the uncaused cause, and which, of course, the Jews and Christians simply call God, is the ultimate reality, is the source of everything else which exists. So when you push behind the things we observe and experience, looking for an explanation as to how they came to be, how they came to exist, you would ultimately encounter this divine person who, by its power, by its wisdom, by its intellect and its will, brought everything else which exists into existence. Okay, so that's kind of the classical worldview. And again, broad stroking it, there are all kind of different nuances and disconnects. And if we pushed out of the realm of philosophy into the realm of theology, we would then be asking different sorts of questions, and there would be disagreement among the Jews, the Greeks, and the Christians, of course. But I'm going to leave it at the level of philosophy for now. So then fast forward several centuries to the post-Renaissance, but especially the post-Enlightenment world. So the scientific revolution is now fully underway, is running on all cylinders. Science has made just astonishing advances Really, the scientific revolution of say the 16th, 17th, 18th century made advances in human knowledge of the natural world that are really comparable to the technological revolution of, say, the last 100 years. If you think of, as I'm recording this, it's July of 2024. If you go back even to July of 1924, and you think of the stunning technological advances in the last 100 years and the almost indescribable difference between what life would have been in 1924 in terms of the technology available and how it was employed, and 2024, it's hard to wrap your mind around. My grandmother happens to be 100 years old. God love her. She was born in 1924. The changes she has seen in technology are just astonishing. Similarly, go back to the 16th, 17th century, 18th century as well, the scientific revolution, in a period of 100, 150 years, the advances in science were so huge, so rapid, so mind-boggling, as to cause a very similar situation where people only a generation or two apart were almost living in a different world scientifically. I point that out simply to say, that I think, given the incredible advances in science in that period of history, again, the kind of post-Renaissance, post-Enlightenment period, it's understandable to some extent that looking at the world scientifically, someone might be tempted to say, someone might be tempted to think, someone might be tempted to hope that one day science would be sufficient to explain everything, which would mean then necessarily, if someday science will be able to explain everything, that must mean necessarily that the ultimate reality is the type of reality that answers to science, that science could in principle discover, that science could in principle understand, that science could in principle demonstrate, that science could in principle manifest. And so I think that temptation, given the cultural context of that time period, is understandable. And there's an additional factor. And this, again, speaking to Catholicism and culture. In the wake of the Protestant Reformation, which of course quickly became not only a theological revolution, but also a political and a cultural revolution across Europe, in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, where the heart of Christendom is really shattered, the Christian unity is shattered, the power of the Catholic Church is sort of the hub of the wheel, the great unifying force in Christendom is shattered. And in its wake, there's a vacuum in the heart of Western civilization, most specifically Europe at that point. But there's a vacuum in the heart of Western civilization. And as people looked at religion in that same 150-year period or so in which science was in its ascendancy, when they looked at religion, they saw endless disagreement on doctrine. They saw infighting amongst Christians. They saw political division arising in the wake of the Reformation, and then eventually religious wars, Protestant versus Catholic, Catholic versus Protestant. They saw Protestant rulers persecuting Catholic subjects and Catholic subjects persecuting Protestant subjects. It was a mess. It was a disaster. A dumpster fire. Religion was a dumpster fire. Meanwhile, you turn around, look in the other direction, and what is science? Science is cool, rational, coherent, logical, methodical, and is making great advances. So it's almost as though you're watching these two great cultural realities on completely opposite trajectories. Religion in steep decline, science in ever more impressive ascendancy. And in that context, some people kind of came to the conclusion there's no way that religion can have the answer to what the ultimate reality is. Science must be able to answer that question. This then becomes known as scientific materialism, essentially the idea that all that exists is matter and motion. In fact, everything which exists is matter and motion is a quote from Thomas Hobbes, a British empiricist philosopher. Empiricists being a school of philosophers who believed that the only true or genuine knowledge is that which is derived from and verifiable by the physical scientists. That view is now more popularly referred to as scientism, the idea that the only genuine or true knowledge is that which is derived from and verifiable by the empirical sciences. But scientific materialism is the idea that everything which exists is ultimately explained simply by matter and motion, which would mean that the ultimate reality is matter. This has come to be, not universally, of course, but has come to be certainly the predominant paradigm for thinking about the ultimate or fundamental realities, that it's something material, that it answers to science, that science will be able to eventually discover it, decode it, and understand how it applies to the building up of all the things that we experience and observe in the universe. Now, we should notice a couple of things, and this is where I'll kind of wrap up. We should notice a couple of things, because I'll talk more about this and I'll nuance out the implications more in future videos. But we should notice that those two views of the ultimate reality, which undergird two worldviews, the classical worldview and now the modernist or postmodernist worldview, are fundamentally incompatible. It cannot be both, and it cannot be a little bit of each. So you cannot have the ultimate reality, the fundamental reality, that reality which explains everything else, be at the same time both a divine person, God, who by power, intellect, and will creates, causes, orders, and designs everything which exists, and at the same time have it be mere matter and motion. A fundamental, quote-unquote, God particle like the Higgs boson, from which you can construct, you can combine and configure Higgs bosons in myriad different ways, and voila, you have everything that we experience and observe in the universe. You can't have it be both, nor can it be a little bit of either, because the ultimate reality is a singularity. It's a singularity which explains everything else. If there's a multiplicity, then you haven't found the ultimate reality yet. You might be getting closer, you might be narrowing the field, but the ultimate reality is that single thing which underlies, undergirds, and explains everything else that we experience and observe in the universe. Okay, so mutually incompatible. And then the worldview that's built on your answer to the question of what is the ultimate reality is also going to be incompatible for those who come from the modernist, postmodernist, scientific materialist worldview, that the ultimate reality, that which explains everything, is just matter and motion. The God particle in various and sundry different interesting combinations and configurations, or whether you answer the question, what is the ultimate reality, by saying the ultimate reality is God. God is the explanation behind everything which exists. I'm going to leave it there for now, but I just wanted to put that question in front of us to kind of think about, to talk about, and then to compare and contrast those two differing answers to what is the ultimate reality, and point to how the classical worldview arrived at its conclusion, and a little bit about how I think the modernist, postmodernist, materialist worldview arrived at its conclusion. And so we'll talk more about the nuances and the implications in future videos. Thanks as always for watching. Please subscribe and like below. Of course, that's a huge help to us here on our YouTube channel. Visit our website, holyfamilyinstitute.com, for more Holy Family Institute projects and resources. And feel free to please share with other friends that you think might be interested in this conversation. As always, remember the church has what the world needs. So learn your faith, live your faith, and share your faith.